So, welcome everybody. Hi, I'm Roger Berkowitz, the director of the Arendt Center, and glad to be here. We're about 1 minute away from starting. We're just waiting for in case anyone else joins. I had some requests from some people that, first of all, I'm going to try and talk for a little less today, a little less time, and if you have some questions from your reading in advance that you'd like addressed right away, you can let me know in the comments. I'm going to sort of focus primarily on the first and the third part of chapter 1. And I thought what I would do, instead of just talking all through at the beginning, I'd focus first on part 1, short, briefly, then see if there's any questions. And you can either raise your questions by writing them, or you can turn your mic on and your video on and speak them. And I see Kazue has already asked a question about human nature, which we should definitely get to. So I'm going to begin. Welcome, and I'm thrilled to have you here again. This is chapter 1 of the human condition. The themes of the prologue, as we talked about last week, are this idea of both labor, of alienation by technology and automation, and also by science and the loss of our earthliness. The human condition is the title of the book. The title that Arendt originally had in mind for the book was the Vita Activa, which is the active life as it's come down through tradition. Her publisher convinced her that the human condition would be a better title, and she switched it to that. She says very quickly and clearly, the Vita Activa, as she understands it, designates the 3 fundamental activities, human activities: labor, work, and action. Now, it's important to understand that there are more than 3 human activities. There's natality she'll talk about, there's thinking, there's mortality. She has a list of many of them later in this chapter and in other places as well. But what she's saying here, I think very clearly and simply, is that there are 3 activities that over the course of human life have become central and meaningful in a way that without them, we are not completely participating in what it means to be human. Now, Kazue has asked this question about the difference between human nature and the human condition. What Arendt means by this is, it's not that there's in our nature a need to be laboring, working, and acting. In fact, humans can exist without laboring, in the sense that we hire slaves or eventually robots to do the labor for us. Humans can live without adding to the work of the world, Arendt says, in the sense that we just use all those things in the world that are already there, but we don't add to them. She does think that we cannot be human in the true sense without action. But none of these are, but when she says that, she doesn't mean that we would cease to be human by nature and what humans are, because we could imagine that we supplant our human nature, our human need to act, and create another kind of human who behaves, who follows orders. And we would still be human according to nature. What she means is that these are the activities, desires, dreams, and facilities of being human that have emerged over the 2,500 years or so of human communal existence. Very briefly, she talks about these 3: labor, work, and action. Labor, for her, is associated with biology and with life. Ants labor. all animals labor. In laboring, we create the consumptive goods that we eat, that we consume, that we use to live in. Things that don't last, like bread, is the quintessential laboring good, consumer goods. And the thing about labor is that they are necessary. We need to labor to live. And what she's saying is that labor is part of the human condition. Throughout the history of man, the history of humanity, we have needed to labor in order to live, and thus being enslaved to necessity is part of being human. That said, it is possible for humans to overcome their labor. They can hire slaves or hire workers who labor for them. The other important thing to remember about labor is that since it creates things that are temporary and consumed, those things that it creates, like bread or clothes, disintegrate and are not left behind. And thus, labor is a cyclical phenomenon. It goes around in circles in the sense that you labor, you create food, you live, you die, new people come along, and you leave nothing behind. It's about a species being, which is why Marx is so interested in it. And thus, labor is not worldly. It doesn't create things that last in the world. Are there questions about labor before I go on to work? Does anyone want to ask a question about labor or about what I said about the human condition, as Kazue was asking? Does anyone want to raise a question here? Against labor, she invokes the idea of work. Work is different from labor because if labor is cyclical and goes in circles and creates nothing that lasts, the main part of work is that it creates the objects, the tables, the books, the buildings, the objects that make our world, our communal world. And since we share objects, you and I share this computer somehow that we're talking to. If we sit around a table, we share the table, and the table does what? It connects us to a common world. That's the quintessential example of the work object. You're sitting around a table, and you by that table, that use object, find something common that connects you. And so work creates an artificial world that can last and endure. And in our connection to each other through that world, we come to share a world together. The highest kind of work objects are works of art that last and endure, whether they're poems or stories or paintings or architectural buildings that we share as a people and that unite us in some way as people who recognize those stories, recognize those buildings, and live in and amongst them. The third main activity of the Vita Activa is action. And as I said before, while men can be human, in her view, and be part of the human condition without labor, if they hire slaves or employees, and while they can be human if they don't actually make things but just live in the world of things, she really does say on page 176, so we'll get to it later, that men cannot be human. They cannot have the dignity of being human if they don't act. So action is the sort of most important of these three conditions of the human condition, the Vita Activa. But I want to be clear that all three are actually for her part of the human condition, not just action. What is action? Action is speaking and doing things, acting, in public in such a way that your speech and actions are unpredictable, spontaneous in such a way that they become noticed and thus talked about in such a way that they create memory and history that unites us as a people. The basic condition for action is plurality, which means that we are all the same in the sense that we are somehow human, and yet also fundamentally different in that we see the world and think and have opinions that are different. And what action does is it acts in such a way that that difference and that surprisingness strikes others. We begin to talk, and we come to recognize that despite our differences, there's a common sameness. So action is what unites a group of plural and different people together into a common polity. So action is the source of politics. So let me stop there and ask: do you have any questions about this part one of
Yes.
chapter one? Yes. Carrie?
Yes, Roger. I would like to ask a question. I was wondering what is going on. What does Arendt tell us about the feelings in relationship to labor, to work, and to action?
The feelings.
Yes.
That's an excellent question. Can you say a little bit more about why you ask it? Why feelings?
Well, yes, I asked that because I was wondering, I mean, when we talk nowadays about labor and work,
Yeah.
we are involved with our feelings. So what does she tell us about feelings in relationship to these notions?
Well, I mean, my initial reaction is that she sees labor as a necessity. It's a life necessity, and we approach labor in our zoological sense. So there's a difference between bios and zoon in Greek, and as laboring, we're like animals, and so there's a need, and I guess the feeling of labor is one of need on the one hand, but also it leads to happiness, right? And this is actually, if you finish the book, you'll see the last chapters are about how we've become overly laboring and not enough acting and working. And labor, insofar as it leads to consumption and leads to the consumption of daily goods, makes us happy. And so the feeling I would associate with labor, I think, in her work is happiness and need, and the satisfaction of needs, which makes us happy. Whereas the feeling of action is the feeling of the joy of doing something new. It's the joy of the experience of breaking convention and doing something new in a way that is surprising and deeply human. It means it is human to do something new. Does anyone else want to respond? Or
May I continue? I have a second question.
Yes.
I just would like to know, because she talks about the feeling of feeling at home in relationship with the work. She says somewhere work procures us the feeling to be at home, to feel at home.
Yes, that's right.
You know, and so I was just wondering whether responding to our needs, there isn't any good feeling, and responding to work, there is a good feeling. You know what I mean?
Right. So I don't want to say that in labor there's no good feeling. I mean, I assume that most of us would be dissatisfied in a significant way if we had no happiness in the world. But what she says is that if we only care about happiness, we lose sight of the other qualities. I think you're right. So if labor is a feeling of happiness associated to it, and action has a feeling of joy, of the freedom of acting, work is the feeling would have the feeling of being at home, at being in a common world, of being in a world that you have created. I think that's a fair reading. I had never thought about the feelings associated with ones before. Are there other questions? Thanks, Karen.
Roger?
Yeah.
In connection with this discussion that you've just conducted, I wonder if you would compare this structure of Hannah Arendt's with Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
With Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
it's a ladder that's not unlike the description here, where he begins with the basic biological needs and he ends with this idea of self-actualization, which is really, I think, not too distant from Hannah Arendt's sense of that liberation, that freedom that comes with action, that
right.
that joy that comes with action.
Who is this? Who is this? Just so I know who's speaking.
I'm sorry. This is Jack Hirschfeld.
Oh, hi, Jack.
Hi.
No, I think that's a good question, Jack. One thing I want to say is that I don't think for Arendt there's a hierarchy in these three, and so it's often read as if it is a hierarchy. There's labor is the lowest, work is the second, and action is the third. And while I mentioned earlier, and it's true that she says that action is sort of the one thing that the dignity of man cannot do without, I want to emphasize that that all three are for her part of the human condition, and that the human condition is to a certain degree diminished without any of them, but also that work is deeply important. And in fact, we could not have the meaningfulness of action without work, because if one acts and does something surprising and new, that action will disappear, will be fleeting, unless artists create stories or artworks to memorialize it. And so she says that you can't, that the actor actually is in need of homo faber in order to complete the action and complete the meaningfulness of the action. So on one level, I just want to say that it's important to understand that while there is a way in which she elevates action without work would not allow us to actually create a human world, and action and work even without labor would not create a world in which we could survive. And so we need all three. Does that? Now, I have to admit I haven't read the Maslow in a long time, so I can't say so much about it. But does that help in some way?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. You can mute me back now.
Oh, okay. Well, you can mute yourself and come back.
All right.
I know,
okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I know that there's a couple other questions. Do you want to ask them or you want me to read them? Kazue has a question about labor as bodily satisfaction. Kazue, do you want to add to that? Or not? So, but basically I said before that labor is the feeling of need, and thus bodily need. Go ahead, Kazue.
Hi, I'm sorry. No, I just think that talking about how different feelings involves among three activities is a tricky subject. But in terms of labor particularly, as you said, it related to sustaining of bodily needs. And I think somewhere in this book, Arendt herself said, when you do physical labor, even though it's hard, we get physical fatigue which make us satisfied. That, I work out, I did hard labor. I think if we can specify what kind of feeling involves specifically the activity of labor, that physical satisfaction. But once you sleep overnight, usually that disappears.
Yes. Yes. And I think that, it's an interesting case. Labor is for her not an unimportant human condition. We want to have that feeling of having worked for our necessities, and yet it is a kind of enslavement. and we need to recover from it. I mean, we will talk more about each of these, labor, work, and action, obviously, when we read the full chapters on labor, work, and action. But I'm the question of the how we think of feeling of labor. I mean, for her, the main issue is that it's worldless. Labor creates things that we consume immediately. They can make us happy. They can satisfy needs, but they do nothing to connect us with other people.
Right. May I throw a curveball?
What?
May I throw a curveball?
Yes,
ball?
please. Yes.
I'm wondering, how can we say journalism, news, we listen on radio, watch on TV, reading on PC or newspaper. Journalism, news itself seems under the category of work. We code what happened, we discuss what happened. However, we consume, we moves on.
Yeah.
So, is journalism really work, or does it have some kind of labor aspect?
Well, one of the things that I think we have to remember that Arendt writes these 3 chapters on labor, work, and action, and Arendtians, whatever that term means, have spent years arguing about what is labor, what is work, and what is action, as if there's clear distinctions between all 3 of them. Right. And that's simply not the case. I mean, there are certain activities like building a house to live in, which can be labor in that it satisfies a necessity, but can also be a doing of work insofar as that the house lasts, and it can also be a work of art insofar as the house is beautiful and strikes people and becomes something people talk about.
Exactly.
And to that extent, it can even be an action insofar as it's a new kind of house that makes people think about what unites them together amongst their differences. So I think it's important to realize that. So to then go back to your question of journalism, there are some book-length journalism that lasts and is talked about, can be seen as both an action in that it inserts itself as speech and action into the world, and people respond to it. It can be seen as work insofar as it creates objects that sit on our bookshelves or sit on our table. But to the extent that they're newspapers or blogs that are largely consumed and then out of sight, they would be a kind of labor that are done simply to provide consumption. And so I don't think we can just sort of say news journalism is labor, work, or action. It can be all 3 depending on the quality and the lastingness of it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that was
okay.
That's also it's an interesting thing to think about. But thank you.
Good. I know that there's a question about the hierarchy of contemplation, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Someone asked, Rob Whiteman asked, could you say a bit more about works of art being the highest form of work? Why works of art? Rob, do you want to add to that, or should I just answer it?
Yeah, if I would just add to it, I would question if there is a differentiation in art, and I'm thinking about conceptualizing high culture versus low culture. Are we talking about actually constructing something physical like a book or a sculpture? What about theater and other kinds of storytelling, and maybe other kinds of traditions that we don't necessarily see from Western Europe? These kinds of things.
Okay, these are excellent questions, and let me say that I'm not going to be able to do them all right now. When we read the chapter on work, and especially the last part of it on art, which is in the chapter on work, section 23, we'll talk much more about art. It's one of the most important sections of the whole book. And on the most basic level, art itself is the highest form of work because it endures the longest, right? I can produce a book, but at some point we might throw that book out and buy another one, or we produce a table and eventually we throw the table out. Unless that table is a work of art that we then preserve in a museum, or we or become something that is passed down through the generations, it eventually too will be consumed and disappear. Artworks for Arendt are those works that, because they are seen to be beautiful and meaningful, last and are preserved and endure throughout generations and throughout cultures. And as a result, those works of art are the most worldly. So, you and I may share a computer, but we may get a different computer tomorrow. But we all have Arendt's The Human Condition as a work of art that for 50, 60 years, people have been reading and talking about and thinking about. And this work of art, not in its physical form, but as a story, as an act of speech, or poetry, if you will, which I think is really what it is, becomes a work of art that endures and that generations of people talk about, and it connects them so that there are people who've read The Human Condition over the years in such a way that they come to share a world together. And amongst the different kinds of work of art, these are excellent questions. So she thinks of theater as closest to action, insofar as the theater and performance art acts in front of people and in such a way is freer. It can interact with people, and it can be part of the world of action and politics. Such that in some of her essays, she talks about the way that all politics, the highest form of politics, is theatricality and performing art. The most enduring form of art for her is poetry, simply because all other forms of art, to a certain extent, are limited in time and place and will eventually erode and corrode, whereas only poetry has the ability to last for an infinite duration and be spoken and told all over the place in such a way that it can create an artificial world in this sort of profound way. But we can talk more about that unless you have a particular question when we get to the work chapters. Is that all right, Rod?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. John, you want to ask your question? She defers consideration of the Vita Activa and Contemplativa from subsequent discussion of the book. Is this correct? Can you say more about that, John? Or are you there? I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, I'm here. But, I just, when I was reading that part in section 2, I think, isn't it, on the Vita, Contemplativa, I got the impression that she, even though she discussed it, she then said that she wasn't really going to include that in the book. And I haven't read any further on, so I don't know whether that's the fact or not.
No, it doesn't come back. I mean, I think what she's saying is, as I said, the original title for this book, John, was the Vita Activa. And in part 1 of this chapter, she talks about the Vita Activa, and she says, here's what I mean by the Vita Activa. She says the first lines of the chapter, excuse me, with the term Vita Activa, I propose to designate 3 fundamental human activities: labor, work, and action. Part 2 is simply going back and saying, look, I'm using this word Vita Activa not in the way it's usually used, right? Vita Activa is a word that is taken from Augustine, who translates Aristotle's Bios Politikos, the political life of man, right? Bios is the way that humans live as opposed to animals, zoos, so on. And for Augustine, the Vita Activa was the bios politicos, and he saw it largely in a negative sense as the opposite of the Vita Contemplativa, the idea of contemplating what is true and good, and thus the world of the divine. And for Augustine, the Vita Activa, and for the tradition, the Vita Activa is given a negative sense, which it didn't have in Aristotle. But it is the sense of sort of the needs that are of the unquiet, needs of the body and needs of man in the physical world against the true needs of man in the contemplating divine rational world. And all she's saying is in part 2, here's a little history of the Vita Activa. I'm using it in a different way, and it's sort of I think it's more of a clearing of the ground, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
So I mean, there's a lot of interesting history in these few pages of part 2, but it's not the most important part of the book, and it doesn't come back, if that's your question. It only comes back to the extent that much of Arendt's way of approaching thinking is opposed to what she calls the inversion of the philosophers, so that the philosophers, Socrates being the case in point, understood originally that life was about speaking and acting in public, in the agora, in the marketplace, in politics. And then what happened? Socrates was killed for speaking and acting in the marketplace. And the philosopher said, oh no, if we're going to speak truthfully and get killed, that's bad. So what we need to do is, in a sense, retreat from the active world into a world of contemplation where we can pursue the truth free from the dangers of the public world. And she sees this as the beginning of the separation of philosophy from politics, and of the life of the mind from the life of action. And in many ways, a lot of her work is an attempt to bring them back together. So she's trying to use the Vita Activa in a much more original and different sense than this original distinction between Vita Activa and Vita Contemplativa. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Jacob, I know had a question, or if there's another one. Yeah. Jacob, did you want to say something?
Sure. So I wanted to ask you, and if you want to move on, that's fine, but I wanted to ask you about the last paragraph in the first section, where she says that the conditions of human existence can never, quote, explain what or who we are because they never condition us absolutely.
Yeah.
And it sounded to me, and she says this is in opposition to, anthropology, psychology, etc. And when she said that, it sounds to me like she's talking a little bit about like a metaphysical idea of the human, because if we strip all of the conditions away, then what else is there left to explain or describe what it is to be human?
Okay, that's a good question, because so what she's trying to do here, and this is the question that someone else asked earlier about the relation between the human condition and human nature, is she wants to insist that in talking about the human condition, she's not trying to answer the question, what is man? Or the question, who is man? The question, what is man, she says, can only be answered by God. I mean, we didn't create man. God created us. Only God can know what man is. And while the question, who is man, is a good question, she says, in the end, we don't know the answer, and we really can't. the human condition is not attempt to say what man is in any human nature way, in the sense that this is the nature of man, and if we're not that, we're no longer man. You ask, is it metaphysical? Depends what you mean by metaphysical, Jacob. It is. She is not endorsing a kind of metaphysical, beyond the physical claim of this is man. And what she says here is that the natural sciences and the social sciences, to the extent that they mimic the natural sciences, seek to do what metaphysics has always done, which is answer the question, what is man? To try and study man in such a way that we can find the natural laws, whether through biology or chemistry or through sociology or anthropology, that determine what man is, and then are able to predict and control his behavior. This will be what she calls the universal viewpoint, to be able to view man by looking at man, experiment rats or mice in a lab experiment. And when we get to the final chapters of the book and the sections on Galileo and Descartes, we'll be talking a lot about what this means, this idea of the universal science. It's a key part of her book. But what she's saying is that both the natural and, to a certain extent, the social sciences go wrong insofar as they try and answer the question, what is man, and therefore understand man in a way that he can be predicted. In asking after the human condition, she's simply saying, for the last approximately 2,000, 3,000 years, humans have existed, right? They have some nature we don't know. They are people that we can't really know, but they've existed. And over time, we've created certain activities which we think have been meaningful to be human. We need to free ourselves from necessity. We labor. We need to create things in the world, and we need to act. There are other activities, right? There's natality, there's mortality, these things that's worldliness, plurality, earthliness. But she says these are the activities that have generally been around about what it means to be human. Now, it could be that we become human in a different way. That's why it's not nature. But they make up human condition as the human condition has emerged over the last 2,000, 3,000 years. And if you remember what we talked about with the prologue last month, she raises the question, we could be, with science and technology and automation, changing the conditions of being human. And the premise of this book is that we are in danger of eliminating action as a meaningful human condition and limiting work as a meaningful human condition, so that the dominant human condition will become labor. That's the fear driving this book. And that if that were the case, we would still be human beings, but we would be human beings who live in a human world that is not worldly and lasting, like a world of work, and is not one of action and great deeds, like a world of action, and is increasingly one of satisfying needs to make us happy instead of acting to make us joyful and meaningful. We would still be human, but we would be human in a different way, and that's what she means by the human condition. Does anyone have a question on that before I go on? Because we have about 20 minutes, and I'd like to go on to the next part, if that's okay. The last part of this chapter, I think, is the most important part, and I want to make sure we have some time to talk about it. It's called Eternity versus Immortality, and the opposition I hope is clear, but in a nutshell, it goes back to what I was saying about Socrates and the philosophers. The philosophers introduced eternity into the human condition. Namely, they separated themselves from the world into a vita contemplativa, You could sit in your cave or, sit in your room, and you could think about the truth. And that truth was worldless, and it was eternal. It lasted forever and ever. And it was non-political, and it was disconnected from the Vita Activa, the life of the world. This idea of eternal truth, which is worldless and timeless, is fundamentally different from immortality, which was the way the Greeks and the Egyptians and others had understood humanity and human truths prior to the philosophers. Namely, that the gods are immortal, they last forever. The humans are mortal. And yet humans can build things, works of art, create things like states or polities or peoples that last forever. And in doing so, even though human life is mortal, we can raise human life to immortality, to a kind of divine or godly life. To the extent humans have the capacity to become immortal, we only have that capacity through art, namely the creation of objects that last immortally, or through politics, namely the creation of peoples that last forever and preserve their memory and history. Those are the two ways that humans can become immortal. And I just want to read a little bit on page 19 of the book, because these are, I think, very controversial and challenging passages, but I don't think we can really understand the Arendt without them. So on page 19 at the top, she says, the mortality of men lies in the fact that individual life, namely we're individual lives, right, which is mortal, right, that individual life with a recognizable life story from birth to death rises out of biological life. Namely, we will die, and therefore we are mortal, not immortal. This individual life is distinguished from all other things by the rectilinear course of its movement, which, so to speak, cuts through the circular movement of biological life. Biological life, simply of animals, is circular because all you have are ants. You don't have individuals. But in humans, we live this rectilinear life where a human is born and dies, and that human ends. But the species will continue. This mortality, that we die, to move along a rectilinear line in a universe where everything, if it moves at all, moves in a cyclical order. So that's what differentiates man from other non-human species. We're mortal. Now here's the next and key lines. The task and potential greatness of mortals, that is, human beings, lie in their ability to produce things, works, deeds, and worlds. So works, things and artworks, deeds, actions, and words, speech, which would deserve to be, and at least to a degree, are at home in everlastingness, so that through them mortals could find their place in a cosmos where everything is immortal except themselves. So what she's saying here is that the task and greatness, potential greatness of all human beings is that we can create works of art, create deeds, create worlds that last, and in lasting make us immortal in a way that gods are. That's what makes humans different from mice and ants and dogs, or one of the things that does. And that by their capacity for this mortal deed, I'm going to just continue, by their ability to leave non-perishable traces behind, things that last, that endure, men, their individual mortality notwithstanding, attain an immortality of their own and prove themselves to be of a divine nature, in quotes, divine. This distinction between man and animal, namely that man can become divine, become immortal, whereas animal simply is cyclical. This distinction between man and animal runs right through the human species itself. This is a very profound line. She's not saying that some people are human and some people aren't. But what she is saying, and it's something that we have to grapple with in her work, is that some people who act and create lasting things that deserve to and do last more actualize their humanity than other people. There are some humans that are more actualizing of their human potential than other humans. All humans have that potential. All humans have dignity because they're humans and have that potential. But some humans are able to act in ways that, in a sense, actualize that potential. Only the best, the Aristoi, who constantly prove themselves to be the best and who prefer immortal fame to mortal things, are really human. Right? It's a strong, strong line. The only people who truly, fully actualize their humanity are those who seek immortality, who seek to do great things, who seek to build things, make things, do things, and participate in a world that will be remembered. Now, there's a lot of people today who would go, oh my God, she's like, that's pretty bad, right? Because it seems to say that some people aren't human. It's not what she's saying, and we have to sort of read more of her work and a lot of her work to really understand that. But what she is saying is that to be human is to, at least as the conditions of humans have emerged over 3,000 years, not human nature, but human condition, has been to do all three: labor, work, and action. And that it's also the case that some people don't do much labor, and some people don't do much work, and some people don't do much action. And that we are, unfortunately for her, entering an era, or living in an era, in which fewer and fewer people act and fewer people work in the sense of create lasting things. So that the dominating aspect of the human condition is simply labor, which is life, keeping ourselves alive and enjoying, which reduces us more and more to the aspect of humanity which is most like our animality. So then you get the next sentence. The others who don't prefer immortal fame and mortal things, the others content with whatever pleasures nature will yield them, live and die like animals. It's a very powerful couple of sentences. I'm sure you have some questions about it. Maybe I'll stop there and let you ask a couple of questions. Or are there anyone want to?
Well, I'd like to say just one thing. That's the sentence after the one that you just quoted.
Yeah.
Which says the opinion of an opinion whose equivalent one will find in hardly any philosopher after Socrates.
Right. This was the opinion of Heraclitus. We don't find it in almost any philosopher after Socrates. Why? Because philosophers after Socrates have turned to the question of eternity and not immortality. Philosophy with Socrates becomes a withdrawal from the public world, and thus a focus simply on the eternal, the true center of metaphysics, but not on the human activity of building a world and acting in a way that humans distinguish themselves and achieve immortality. So that the aim of philosophy switches from immortality to eternity, and thus philosophy becomes, in a worldly basis, irrelevant. And that's part of her critique of philosophy. Now, the ideas of philosophy, insofar as they become works of art and last and endure and are talked about, re-enter the world, right? But from her point of view, they largely do so in the way that they pull us away from the conditions of action and towards the conditions and the way of being of contemplation. And so she worries that philosophy is part of the de-worldification, the worldlessness of the world. You know, the point here is that action, one of the fundamental human activities, requires people to act in ways in public that are new, surprising, plural, and in a sense shocking, that shock us and compel us to pay attention to them and tell stories about them. The only people, action is thus dangerous, which is why Socrates was killed, right? To act is to always risk yourself, which is, she also says that the highest political virtue is courage. It's the courage to act in the world. Philosophers generally are not that courageous anymore. Because they don't talk about the world, but just talk about truth, they protect themselves from being killed. Because unlike Socrates, they don't actually engage in action in the world. What she's interested in is in the threats to the human condition today, namely the threats to action, which we're going to get into. And one indication of that threat to action and the human idea of action is that we have increasingly cared less and less about immortality. And on a philosophical level, that concern with immortality has been replaced with eternity. One result of this is, and we're going to get to this next week, is that we replace property with wealth, right? We no longer think of a house or an estate as something that we build and pass down through generations. We think of houses as wealth that we buy and sell and can cash out, and the property doesn't have the same kind of worldliness, and so we move from a world of property to a world of wealth. It's part of a widespread lack of concern with living in and creating worlds that deserve to be and do last. And instead, we create worlds of consumption that give us wealth and happiness. Oh, sorry about that. Not sure what just happened. Hello? You see me?
Not really. Better.
What just happened?
But we can hear you.
All right, I don't know what just happened. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that for her, the immortal world is a world in danger of being lost, and that's the world in which we are called to do great things and act in ways that are surprising. And without that immortal world, there is always the risk of simply worrying about the consumption world of necessities and happiness, and not the world of meaning and greatness. And that is very much what she is worried about. I don't know what's happened here to my screen, but it just suddenly changed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Does anyone want
hear
to
you.
respond?
We
Does
don't
anyone want to
see
respond? Okay. Does anyone want to respond? We're almost out of time, but I thought maybe people. This is a very controversial and
Yes.
very difficult idea, and I'm wondering if people want to talk about it a little bit.
Well, I would like to know what it is meant. What is meant by the best? And they should try to do the best for themselves. What does it mean? Can you tell me this, Roger?
Well, I mean, what she says, the best, when she says only the best, the aristoi, who prove themselves to be the best, are really human. What she means is that the best in this sense are the ones who act for the public. They don't act simply to get wealthy. They don't act simply to increase their own wealth or happiness, but they act to create and be part of a public world. Well, to act as part of a public world, what do you have to do? You have to act in a way that matters to other people. How do you act in ways that matter to other people? Well, you act in public, and then people respond and say, oh, I like that. Oh, I'll tell a story about that. Oh, I will see my commonality with you. So the best are those who give their lives not to their consumption and their private engagement and their labor only, although that's also important, you need to live, but who actually seek to be part of and build and identify those ideas that we share as a people. And in identifying those ideas that we share as a people, we create a kind of world that unites the individuals within it and is worthy of lasting. And it's those people who act in this public way with the idea of articulating artworks and ideas that are not just to be consumed, that aren't going to be thrown away, but that last. Why do they last? Because they deserve to last. Why do they deserve to last? Because they speak to a wide range of different and plural people. And that's what it means for her to be human, is to be fully actualize our potential, because that's how humans can become people who build things that are common and not just individual, and thus can create things that are great. Now, I think a critique of hers is, well, why should we create things that are great? Why should we assume that it is human to create lasting institutions? And her answer is that that's what humans have been able to do for centuries and millennia, and it's what we've recognized as the highest activity of being human, to create the great artists, create great works, the great politicians, unite people together. And that without great actors, without people who strive for immortality, there can be no more great art, and there can be no more great politics. And what she's here talking about with the threat to the human condition, but here trying to articulate the human condition, is that part of the human condition has been for 3,000 years to act, and to act has meant to strive for immortality. The very fact that this striving makes so many of us uncomfortable is one of the reasons why it's disappearing. And her work is an attempt to at least make us aware of the fact that it is disappearing and raise the question of what it means that it's disappearing. Not to say that if it disappears, we'll no longer be human. That's not what she's saying. Not to say that if it disappears, everything will go to hell. That's not what she's saying. She's saying that if it disappears, or if it becomes even more rare, one aspect of what it's meant to be human, which is to create immortal, lasting, great works and great acts of politics, will become incredibly rare or maybe non-existent. And what does that mean? That's the question raised in the book.
Thank you.
We're at 12. If does anyone want to make a final comment or a question?
No, I just want to say thanks.
Very well, welcome. We'll meet again. I think the second Friday in January. We'll have to pick a date because the first Friday is the 3rd. I don't know if people are going to be around.
Too early.
It's too early, so we'll probably meet. I think the second Friday in January. The public and private chapter is an incredibly rich chapter. I think it's too much to read in 1 week, so I'm going to break it into 2 if that's okay with people, and we'll send out the reading. Are there any final comments or questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
There it is. And I don't know whether I'm producing an echo for everybody else in the way that they are producing echoes for me.
I hear you fine.
Okay. Well, some of the questions from the other participants have been in severe echo form. Just wanted to.
I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I don't know what. We have to figure out some of the technology. I'm glad you pointed that out.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Anyone else? No.
No.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope this was fun. Happy holidays, and I hope to see you all in January.
Yes.
All right. Happy holidays to you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.